Do as they say, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Stefan Berger. Stefan is Professor of Social History and Director of the Institute for Social Movements at the Ruhr-Universität in Bochum. He's also the Executive Chair of the Foundation for the History of the Ruhr and an honorary professor at Cardiff University. Stefan's currently developing a research project that seeks to investigate the memory of industrial pasts and deindustrialization processes in a global perspective. And today he'll be discussing his recent book, Constructing Industrial Pasts, Heritage, Historical Culture and Identity in Regions Undergoing Structural Economic Transformation. So over to you, Stefan, for your 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for a kind introduction. I'll hold the book into the camera. I don't know whether you can see that or whether it's unclear, but it's Constructing Industrial Pasts, Heritage, Historical Culture and Identity in Regions Undergoing Structural Economic Transformation. And it's an edited collection which is sort of assembling case studies from various parts of the world. There are quite a number of case studies on the UK, and we also have Australia, Italy, France, Spain, Germany, Romania, Hungary, and China in them. And there are quite a few people who I see on the little tablets here who have contributed, such as, for example, Arthur MacIver or Hilary Orange or Marion Fontaine, and I hope now that I haven't forgotten anyone, but if so, please forgive me. Jana, of course, Jana Golombek's also in there. But I'm not going to talk about the individual chapters of the book, but rather I would like to use my, I guess in the meantime, 5 minutes to talk a little bit about a framework for global comparison I have been trying to develop through this and a range of other publications over recent years. Essentially, I think what I'm interested in establishing is whether we can talk about certain regimes of deindustrialization in global perspectives, and whether we can relate those regimes of deindustrialization to particular forms of heritagization, so of constructing industrial heritage. And whether these constructions of industrial heritage involve different ways of memorializing the industrial past. And in terms of the different memory regimes, I'm working in particular with a theory of agonistic memory that has been developed by Hans-Lauge Hansen and Anna Cento-Bull in an article in Memory Studies in 2016 entitled On Agonistic Memory, where they differentiate between antagonistic memory, cosmopolitan memory, and agonistic memory. It's not specific to deindustrialization and its memory. In fact, we've tried to use that concept of agonistic memory in a Horizon 2020 project on the memory of war in 20th century Europe, but I think it would also be possible to use this theory of agonistic memory for the study of memory regimes in relation to deindustrialization. In terms of the different regimes of deindustrialization, my current typology, if you like, works on the assumption that we have a regime of deindustrialization that can be associated with what I call the Anglo countries, in particular the UK and the US, but also parts of the global South, in particular the capitalist global South, where we have strong doses of neoliberalism leading to forms of heritagization that see very few attempts from above, if you like, from governments, from official circles, of establishing any form of industrial heritage and any kind of discourse surrounding the industrial past, and where therefore this void is taken by social movements from below, who are trying to memorialize the industrial pasts in a way that often amounts to counter discourses, to kind of counter hegemonic discourses, to use a concept from Gramsci, to the official silence that we see often in those neoliberal versions of deindustrialization. Another regime of deindustrialization, I would argue, can be found in continental Western Europe, where we have very different, but nonetheless all corporatist regimes of deindustrialization, where we see a much stronger role of the state and an attempt to embed capitalism much more than we have seen in the Anglo countries and in parts of the capitalist global South. In those corporatist regimes, who are, of course, very different, and I'm very much aware that this is at the moment a very crude typology where you have to be aware of all sorts of differences within this cluster of countries that I assemble in or under one of those rubrics. But nevertheless, I think we see in Western Europe forms of corporatism that mean that we also have quite a strong attempt from above, from governments, from official circles, to construct industrial heritage discourses that are related to justifying the deindustrialization strategies of forms of embedded capitalism in those respective countries. I think a third typology is those of the post-communist countries in Eastern Europe, but also in the global South, including China and some of the other post-communist countries in the global South, where we see also very divergent strategies, which is why I think I would probably divide that kind of cluster into post-communist Eastern Europe, where we see a turn to radical market reforms after 1990, which again leaves a kind of trail of destruction in terms of deindustrialization, with very little attempts from above to forge the memory of the industrial past, but also no social movements from below taking that place. So here I think we have a large-scale silence with only small minority groups trying to formulate narratives, discourses around memory of the industrial pasts. Whereas in China and some of the other post-communist countries of the global South, we see massive attempts to construct industrial heritage from above, all justifying and legitimating the ongoing rule of communist parties in those countries and being strongly functionalized in pursuit of this aim of legitimating communist rule in those countries. So I think I've probably already gone above my 7 minutes, so I'll shut up here. I'll be interested to get reactions to this sort of, as I say, first very crude attempt to arrive at some form of global comparison of memory regimes of deindustrialization. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stefan. Perfectly timed, let's say. Thanks very much. So our next speaker is Marion Fontaine from the University of Avignon, and I'll introduce the French speakers in French. I'm afraid my language skills don't extend to introducing the German speakers in German, but you know, we'll make a gesture against the English linguistic imperialism. So Marion Fontaine est maîtresse de conférences en histoire contemporaine à l'Université d'Avignon et chercheuse au centre Norbert Elias. Elle a travaillé à l'origine sur les relations entre sport et construction de l'identité ouvrière. Donc elle a publié Le Racing Club de Lens et Les Gueules Noires en 2010. Ses travaux concernent désormais la désindustrialisation et la crise des mondes ouvriers, à partir notamment du cas des mineurs de charbon en France et en Europe. Donc, elle a publié Fin d'un monde ouvrier, Liévin 74 en 2014. Et donc, elle a co-dirigé avec Xavier Vigna un numéro spécial de 20 et 21, La désindustrialisation, une histoire en cours. Voilà. Donc, Marion.
Merci beaucoup, Jackie. Attends, voilà. Est-ce que vous voyez mon écran? Donc, merci beaucoup, Jackie, pour cette présentation. Donc, je vais vous présenter, en effet, aujourd'hui, le numéro spécial intitulé « La désindustrialisation, une histoire en cours » que nous avons dirigé avec mon collègue Xavier Vigna. Il est vraiment désolé de ne pas pouvoir être avec nous aujourd'hui. Donc, ce numéro est paru à la toute fin de l'année 2019 dans l'une des principales revues françaises d'histoire contemporaine, 20 et 21. L'idée de ce numéro, elle est partie d'un constat que nous avons fait tous les deux, Xavier Vigna et moi. Donc Xavier et moi, nous travaillons depuis un petit moment sur l'histoire des mondes ouvriers en France. Xavier a écrit une synthèse sur l'histoire des ouvriers en France. J'ai écrit, donc Jackie l'a dit, le livre qui s'appelle « La fin d'un monde ouvrier ». Donc nous avions cette connaissance-là par nos recherches. Nous savions aussi qu'il y avait toute une série d'études et de recherches nouvelles en langue française sur les thématiques de la désindustrialisation. Vous pouvez en voir ici quelques exemples. Mais en même temps, nous avions l'impression que ces études étaient beaucoup moins diffusées, surtout beaucoup plus dispersées que ce n'était le cas dans l'historiographie anglophone. Il y a par exemple beaucoup moins de dossiers, de numéros spéciaux sur la désindustrialisation, sur ces thématiques, dans les grandes revues généralistes en histoire de langue française. Il y a aussi, et je pense que c'est un point important, des différences du point de vue des méthodes et des thématiques. Les historiens de langue française, alors c'est une impression un peu impressionniste, il faudrait pouvoir développer, recourent moins, même si c'est en train de changer, à l'histoire orale et davantage aux archives institutionnelles, publiques, concernant l'État, les ministères, aux archives des entreprises. Les historiens francophones se sont beaucoup penchés sur l'aspect politique de la désindustrialisation, sur les luttes et les mobilisations, sur le rapport à l'État, et moins que l'ont fait leurs collègues anglophones sur l'aspect culturel, émotionnel, sur les mémoires ouvrières, sur les questions de patrimoine et d'héritage industriel. Et je trouve d'ailleurs, j'insiste sur ce fait, que c'est une piste intéressante. Stefan Berger l'a déjà un peu dit. La désindustrialisation a été d'un côté un phénomène global. En même temps, ça a été un phénomène extrêmement variable selon les pays, selon les configurations régionales, selon aussi, je pense, l'histoire et la relation que chaque pays entretenait avec l'industrie et le monde ouvrier. Et jusqu'à aujourd'hui, j'ai l'impression que cette relation avec l'histoire industrielle et ouvrière pèse sur les manières de faire l'histoire de la désindustrialisation aujourd'hui. Mais je pense que c'est une discussion que nous pourrons continuer à avoir ici. Donc ce contexte, en tous les cas, il explique les objectifs qui étaient les nôtres quand nous avons voulu faire ce dossier. C'était des objectifs à la fois scientifiques et pédagogiques, puisqu'il s'agissait de faire connaître aux lecteurs d'une revue d'histoire généraliste des recherches sur la désindustrialisation en France, mais aussi hors de France. C'est la raison pour laquelle vous avez le sommaire ici. Nous avons voulu présenter les travaux de chercheurs francophones sur la question. Je dis francophones parce qu'il y avait des Français aussi des Belges, donc des chercheurs confirmés comme Mathieu Tracol, comme Jean-Michel Minoves, des chercheurs aussi débutants qui faisaient leur thèse, comme Romain Castellesi, comme Antoine Tabuteau. Mais nous avons voulu en même temps, en opérant toute une série de traductions, présenter aux lecteurs quelques exemples. Nous aurions voulu qu'ils soient plus nombreux, nous aurions voulu présenter des exemples allemands, par exemple, des recherches internationales menées dans ce domaine. C'est le cas pour les articles de Gilda Zazzara sur le cas italien et pour les articles d'Arthur McIvor et de Stephen High sur les cas états-uniens et écossais. Et je tiens à souligner, je peux le dire maintenant à Stephen et à Arthur, que c'est quand même l'un de nos grands motifs de satisfaction que d'avoir fait découvrir, y compris à nos collègues de XXe siècle, des recherches qu'ils connaissaient peu et des méthodes qu'ils connaissaient aussi peu. Il est assez rare, en fait, dans une revue comme 2021, qu'il y ait deux articles qui utilisent totalement ou partiellement des sources d'histoire orale. Donc, je pense que nous avons aussi essayé de faire discuter des méthodes qui ne discutent peut-être pas assez. Alors, à travers ces articles et à travers, nous avons voulu mettre en avant une chose essentielle, la nécessité de continuer et d'approfondir une histoire large de la désindustrialisation, comme processus historique, bien sûr, mais comme processus qui se poursuit toujours au présent. C'est le sens du titre « La désindustrialisation, une histoire en cours », une histoire qui n'est pas terminée. Et nous avons voulu aussi souligner, justement par rapport à une certaine perspective très économique, que l'histoire de la désindustrialisation n'était pas simplement un changement de structure économique, mais qu'elle impliquait un basculement beaucoup plus ample et beaucoup plus profond concernant la définition des individus et des collectifs, à commencer bien sûr par les mondes ouvriers, les formes du travail, les imaginaires qui les entourent, le fonctionnement des États adossés à l'industrialisation, le rapport au temps et à l'espace, etc. Donc nous avons voulu, partiellement, il nous aurait fallu 4 numéros de 20-21 pour y réussir plus totalement, essayer d'articuler les différentes perspectives sur lesquelles nous travaillons, mais les perspectives aussi que nous avions eu l'occasion de lire. Donc en travaillant sur la désindustrialisation dans le temps, en travaillant, bon ça c'est un aspect évidemment que je connais plus particulièrement, mais sur les politiques de la désindustrialisation, aussi bien à l'échelle nationale qu'à l'échelle européenne, avec le très bel article de Nicolas Verschuren sur la question. Nous avons voulu aussi croiser les histoires de désindustrialisation par le bas, par l'approche des vies ouvrières, que ce soit par le biais des questions de la santé, avec l'article d'Arthur McIvor ou l'article de Simon Hay, par le biais des questions de genre, avec l'article d'Amandine Tabuteau, etc., etc. Donc, essayer de développer une approche vaste de la désindustrialisation qui inclut les différentes perspectives. Alors, quel bilan on en tire aujourd'hui? Je pense que ce numéro nous a vraiment permis de faire le point sur l'état de certaines recherches, et il ne constitue pas tant une conclusion ou une fin qu'une invite à creuser et à voir toutes les pistes qui encore se présentent à nous. C'est par exemple au moment de ce numéro que nous avons vraiment discuté avec Xavier Vigna d'un thème qui a fait l'objet d'une des sessions précédentes ici, c'est-à-dire des questions d'économie morale, de pacte moral appliqué à la compréhension de certains moments, de certaines mobilisations liées aux fermetures d'usines et à la manière dont on pouvait appliquer ces notions dans le cadre d'autres situations industrielles, francophones ou ailleurs. Donc, c'est un seul exemple parmi toutes les questions que nous avons pu poser et au fond, je me dis, et je pense que Xavier ne serait pas en désaccord avec moi, que si ce numéro a pu contribuer justement à faire émerger ce type de questions, à alimenter des recherches et des débats, à faire dialoguer des historiographies francophones et anglophones qui, jusqu'au projet dépôt, ne dialoguaient pas tellement, je crois que nous n'avons pas tout à fait perdu notre temps et que nous avons ouvert des voies de dialogue que ce projet dépôt et que d'autres permettent de poursuivre. Voilà, j'espère que je n'ai pas été trop longue.
Merci Marion, c'est parfait, merci. Merci beaucoup. So our next speaker, yes, well-earned round of applause for Marion. Our next speaker is Stefan Moitra. If you're ready to go, Stefan. Stefan is a researcher at the Deutsches Bergbau-Museum in Bochum in Germany. From 2006 to 2008, he was a Marie Curie Fellow at the Centre for European Studies at University College London, where he also did his PhD on working class culture and cinema in Germany and Britain after 1945, a comparative study of South Wales and the Ruhr. And more recently, he's conducted an oral history project on life stories and memories of West German coal mining, a collaboration between the DBM and the foundation history of the Ruhr. He's also a coordinator for the working group Memory and Deindustrialization in the European Labour History Network. So I'll hand over to you, Stefan, on that note.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I guess you can all hear me, right? And see my presentation, because I have some connection problems today. The first thing I want to say is that I think I'm on the bill together with my colleague Katarzyna Nogueira, who co-edited this special issue with me, but she excuses herself because she's at a different conference parallel to this, and she has to present something, so she's sorry she can't participate. Yeah, Jackie, you mentioned that I'm also coordinator for the working group Memory and Deindustrialization in the European Labour History Network. And actually, the special issue that I'm presenting here is actually an outcome of our work at in this working group. So the European Labour History Network, in case you're not familiar with it, had its first constituting conference in 2015. And this is when our group also met for the first time, consisting of people mainly from all different kinds of countries, from Western Europe, Northern Europe, and even also the post-communist context. And so when we thought about common themes, we thought the first thing the first idea for a conference would be to do something on oral history and deindustrialization or structural change, to take to pick up a German term for it, because it is such a frequent methodology in deindustrialization studies. So in 2016, we did a conference in Bochum that was entitled Post-Industrial Memories, Oral History and Structural Change. Some of the contributions to that conference have resulted in this special issue of BIOS. BIOS is the one and only oral history journal in the German context. Usually German language as well, so I think this is just the second in its 30-year history or so. It's the second English issue edition of that journal. Right. I think what we wanted to do was to emphasize matters of comparison. And initially, we had different kinds of industrial branches presented, like mining industry. There were contributions about iron and steel industry, harbor and dock works. And when we called the contributors to write down their papers for the special issue, it turned out that they were actually that the industrial branches were not that interesting anymore, not that important anymore for the comparison, but rather there were like two different strands. And that was probably, on the one hand, contributions that focus on narratives and memories of closure and the various ways, sometimes very contradictory ways, in which people narrate and interpret their own working lives, as well as the modes and struggles of the deindustrializing process. And secondly, there was a set of articles that deal with forms of representation in its various forms, in historiography, in the museum, even in photography and graffitis, or in institutionalized heritage discourse, even by UNESCO, for instance, and the roles which oral history narratives and memories play in these kinds of contexts. And here's also often a form of struggling or conflict for the right and appropriate way to represent the history of industrial work and industrial communities. So just to give you one example, we had, where do we see it here? Sorry, there was a, oh, never mind, you can't see it now, can you? No. You see here this article, Janine Schemmer, we are in the museum now, on the Harbor Museum in Hamburg, where she talks about the role of former workers and their memories in the very exhibition, but they also play a role as tour guides and even as co-curators in the museum. But there's a conflict on authority and agency. So sometimes, this is what she mentions, sometimes people actually even, or the former workers actually take objects out of the exhibition and put them somewhere else without telling the actual curators. And there's a constant struggle and conflict about the ways how objects and memory, how they are representing the story of harbor work. So this is like a tiny case study, On the other hand, you have an article from Australia by Annette Holm and Eric Eklund on the Hazelwood power station in the La Trobe Valley that has recently been demolished and put down, which was a result of constant conflicts over years about the actual meaning that Hazelwood Power Station had, from being a symbol of modernity and the height of modernity in the 1960s, to becoming a symbol of climate change and some kind of old, outlived mode of production. And the community that surrounded that power station and its coal mine are now kind of victimized as well. And so they talk about the forming of these memory discourses, and about how also corporate heritage now uses the community memories and makes something different out of it without actually having the communities participate in how this history is presented and interpreted. I want to come back briefly, before coming to the end, I want to come back briefly to the issue of comparative perspectives. Even though all of the contributions collected here remain focused on local or regional cases, it's in their respective similarities and differences in reacting to issues like job loss or early retirement, political campaigning, etc., that they actually speak to each other, different kinds of single cases. To give but one example, I myself contributed an article on ways to absorb and cushion the consequences of mine closure in the Ruhr. And it's a very dominant narrative in the Ruhr that the corporatist effort of the state, trade union, and companies produced a socially responsible system of reducing employment numbers. And apart from oral history testimonies anyway transgressing such hegemonic narratives, the comparison with, for instance, the Scottish cases that Arthur McIver refers to in his article, or similar contexts in the mining region in northern Spain, actually give these a completely different angle from one national context to the other. So I think that is really like the positive results that you get from opening up the perspective and coming to an international comparison. So just summing this up very briefly, what we really wanted to do in the special issue is, on the one hand, think about narratives of closure. Secondly, think about struggles about representation. And thirdly, providing possibilities for comparison. And this is what we looked at. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks very much. Thank you. So our next speaker is Ewan Gibbs. Ewan is my colleague at the University of Glasgow, where he lectures in economic and social history. His research expertise lies in combining archival research with oral testimonies. Ewan recently published his first book with the University of London Press, Coal Country, The Meaning and Memory of Deindustrialization in Post-War Scotland. And I should just mention that it's available free to download if anyone is interested. So a bit of a plug for Ewan's book there. He has also written journal articles on working class politics and protest, collective memories of the industrial era, and on heritage and commemoration. And he's now researching how energy shaped modern Scottish nationalism before beginning a new project next year on work, community and activism during energy transitions in the UK's long movement out of coal since the 1950s. And so I presume that you're going to talk to us about your book today, Ewan.
Yes, the politics of our time in the UK this week were that Wales, the north of England, and Scotland, including the coalfields, voted three very different ways in elections last Thursday. Wales stuck with a Labour Party vote. In the north of England, there were Conservative advances, and the Nationalists won in Scotland, which was particularly marked in former industrial Scotland. I'm going to argue that coal country allows us to assess, at least in one of those stories, the long historical background of economic and cultural changes that preceded them. I'm going to present this through three different elements of the book. So firstly, I'm going to talk about understanding deindustrialization as a long historical process. I'll then address the link between deindustrialization and nationalism. And lastly, I'll look at the role of energy in deindustrialization. Coal country combines an assessment of deindustrialization from above through the lens of policy making, planning objectives, and the management of labour markets between the 1940s and the 1980s, with a perspective from below that looks at experiences from colliery and factory levels. It draws in particular on colliery closure proceedings, which included negotiations with trade union officials and workplace representatives to understand the development of moral economy customs, in particular the expectations that closures would be negotiated, that transfers would be provided for miners, and labour markets would be reinforced through investment in local areas. It then traces the transmission of these expectations from collieries to other industries that were part of that process of managed economic change between the 1940s and 70s, and then the abandonment of moral economy customs in the 80s and 90s. Coalfields were contracting in employment across the UK and especially in Scotland from the 1920s, but I argue in coal country that deindustrialisation, as opposed to simply contraction, becomes apparent from the late 1940s, and that this is visible firstly in the Shotts area of the Lanarkshire coalfield to the east of Glasgow. These areas were subject to strategic divestment, the dramatic and significant rundown of key sectors that had shaped the evolution and culture and politics of towns and villages. That spread out across the Scottish coalfield over the late 1950s and then across the 1960s. Yet that process of regional policy investment that I mentioned in alternative assembly goods industries provided a significant interregnum. I think the miners' willingness to cooperate in early closures and the process of rationalisation between the 40s and the 60s is especially important to then understanding the rationale for their increasing opposition during the 1970s and 1980s. Deindustrialisation and Scottish nationalism are linked in a way which long predates the SNP's displacement of the Labour Party as the dominant party of Scottish politics, and especially the dominant party across what was industrial Scotland. In fact, the initial tremors, electoral tremors of nationalism were felt in the coalfields in West Lothian in 1962, in Hamilton and Lanarkshire in 1967, and later in the development of a breakaway Scottish Labour Party in Ayrshire in the 1970s. In coal country, I understand nationalism's long development as being connected to the politicisation of the Scottish coal field as a single unit under the nationalised coal industry that developed in the UK during the 1940s. It was also connected to energy policy making, which was similarly giving a distinct administrative devolved form in Scotland. So this created a context in which the National Union of Mine Workers Scottish area had an increased interest in communicating itself in a national form. This didn't only have political or policy ramifications, it also had cultural ones. I assess in the coal country the development of a Scottish National Miners' Gala, a major day in the coalfield calendar, which first began in the late 1940s and coincided with nationalisation. This National Gala Day, which was held in the capital city of Edinburgh, took place as local links between coal mining and villages weakened in the context of rationalisation. And I argue that this has continued through into the devolved era. We see across the coalfields in Scotland, I think, an alternative to the Rust Belt Rebellion interpretation of the politics of deindustrialisation, and perhaps a suggestion that progressive coalitions are another possibility. Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, and none of the local authorities in the former coalfields recorded a pro-Brexit vote, which is significantly divergent from developments in England and also in Wales. I think it's also significant that recent campaigns for justice for victimised miners in Scotland have been taking place in the context of devolution and through pressure being placed on a nationalist Scottish government by a Labour Party largely led campaign, which was ultimately acceded to in the context of a devolved parliament, which was itself a long sought for objective of the Scottish Miners' Union. Finally, and somewhat on a different theme, I want to emphasise the significance of energy to understanding deindustrialisation. Coal country presents a carbon economy story. It emphasises the significance to changes in fuel sources, technologies, and economic geographies associated with both. British coal was displaced within a nationally managed energy economy by fuel competition between the 1940s and 70s. This was a product of policymaker agency that was partly informed by hostility to coal on class terms. In the book, I have quotes from senior officials within the British state and within the Ministry for Fuel and Power who refer to the need to break the miners' stranglehold, direct quote, over energy resources. Uneconomic nuclear power programs and imported oil were favoured by different factions on grounds of national security and promoting liberal market competition. Debates over coal and their Scottish national framing also anticipated the later politicisation of North Sea oil, both of which have been central to the remaking of both Scotland's and Britain's political economy in the second half of the 20th century. Contemporary discussions over a just transition from fossil fuels need to be understood in that context of class, power, and competing material interests and the appropriate role of government in the context of global supply chains. This has been visible in Scotland, where workers at the Bifab fabrication yards, which produce parts for wind turbines, occupied their yard in protest that threatened closure in the late 2010s and were at least periodically successful in doing so. They used a language of moral economy entitlement to employment based on the fact that wind turbines were essential to the harnessing of Scottish resources. There are parallels to this in other nations. For instance, the Spanish Just Transition Deal, which brings an end to coal mining and partially on the promise of replacement energy employment, and recent decisions by American miners' unions to favour coming to a deal with the American government, which would see the phasing out of coal jobs through the replacement of employment and alternative renewable sources. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ewan. Thanks very much. So we're going to move from Scotland to the northwest of England now, and we'll hear from Mike Make and Wait. Mike was employed in local government in northwest England for over 30 years, so knows this area extremely well. Following racialised rioting in the deindustrialised town of Burnley in 2001, he led the local council's work to promote community cohesion and good race relations, continuing this role during the decade when the far-right British National Party held a number of seats in the town hall. In 2019-20, Mike was a fellow of the Independent Research Foundation and researched how his work experience fitted into the wider social trauma of deindustrialization and related to relevant academic and social policy debates. So it's with that experience today that Mike is going to talk to us about Burnley, I presume, Mike. Yeah, over to you for 7 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. And that's right. I do want to begin by thanking you, Jackie and Stephen and Lauren and the team for the opportunity to present. And I am talking about my book. There's the plug. I'll put it into the chat as well. Published just 2 weeks ago. And as you say, it focuses on the small town of Burnley in northwest England. It begins by looking back to serious racialised rioting, which took place in Burnley 20 years ago this summer, June 2001. There were similar events that summer in Oldham and in Bradford, and these so-called Northern Town riots generated concerned discussion in Britain about multiculturalism, race relations. They led to new policy approaches by the Labour government under Blair. The year after the riots, and unlike Oldham and Bradford, Burnley became the first place to see a small group of far-right British National Party councillors elected. The BNP later made further gains in the town. They had localised successes in other places, and my book details these developments, looks at the responses that there were from the mainstream political parties, and kind of assesses the significance of those events in a much wider historical context. Back in 2001, the events in Burnley and Oldham, controversial events, were seen as a kind of aberration. Some condescending commentators, politicians, dismissed them as a kind of expression of northern backwardness, an arrogant, a patronising outlook linked to the so-called north-south divide in England. Of course, such explaining away and putting it into a box was a block to understanding what was actually going on. And a key argument I'll make in the book is that the riots and those limited but significant successes for the far right were actually a precursor, an early indication of trends which have become much more generalised in English politics. The expression in our country of the right-wing populism, which is one of the issues which this overall deindustrialisation and politics project is concerned with. I track how these themes of opposition to immigration, racist anxiety about multiculturalism, antipathy to Europe, which we saw in Burnley 20 years ago, were then taken up and popularised by the United Kingdom Independence Party, how they fed into the 2016 Brexit vote, and how they have reshaped the agenda of the Conservative Party. And indeed, Burnley's gone along with those developments. It was a town which voted 2/3 in favour of leaving the European Union, and in 2019 was one of the so-called Red Wall towns constituencies, which the Labour Party lost to Boris Johnson's Conservatives. This deprived, deindustrialised town, I think the 8th most deprived constituency in England, is represented by a Conservative MP. As Jackie says, I was a direct witness to these events. I lived and worked in the town. I was a worker for the local council, the municipality. And then after the first BNP election successes, took on the job of leading work to promote good race relations in Burnley, and held that post during the decade the minority group of far-right councillors were on there. Deindustrialisation is, of course, the context for the events I've sketched. Burnley formed in modern times in the mid-1800s as a cotton manufacturing town, cotton goods with coal mining ancillary. Light engineering in the post-war period became an important part of the local economy, and all these sectors were hit massively by the contraction of manufacturing in the 1980s. As Ewan has said, of course, such developments do not automatically lead to any particular politics. The fact that far-right impulses are inevitable in such circumstances is to accept as an explanation what we've actually got to explain. And so what I emphasize, I think, in the book is the role of local political actors in shaping the responses to the processes of deindustrialization. Quite often we talk about right-wing populism as if it's visited upon towns from above. These vulnerable locales have this thing coming at them. And my arguments, bending the stick a little bit too far the other way, is that actually such politics are often produced from accumulations and combinations of local dynamics, local situations. Certainly in Burnley in the late 1990s, it was a very small group of local political activists who shaped the social divisions and the blaming of racialist outgroups, which prepared the ground for the riots and the far-right breakthroughs. They were connecting to a whole set of emotions. I like Stefan's phrase, I'll really dig into it, about agonistic memory, the way that people make sense of things in terms that they are drawing from the wider culture around them. And certainly the political sense that built up in Burnley was to do with processing the hurts of economic change in declensionist terms, linked to, in my view, the unprocessed loss of the British Empire, the kind of protectionist themes that they've been around the decline of the cotton industry since the Second World War. And right-wing politics of a populist kind take hold in a local context where people have been unsettled already at the level of the street and the neighbourhood and the town. That's where those sentiments resonate and how they resonate. One last point I want to make, Jackie, is that in my view, sometimes it's very important to keep in mind the way that it's not just the economy, it's not just the communities which are affected by the long half-life of deindustrialization. It's actually local institutions like the one I work for and with, like the political parties, who are very much affected and totally reshaped by deindustrialization. They're diminished, they're hollowed out, they're weakened by reductions materially in local income levels, but also, if you like, in terms of morale. And I see a lot of what I was living amongst and have worked on now to write up as a process of demoralization. You know, in material terms, I talk in the book about the council throughout, Burnley Council, the organisation in this big grand town hall in the middle of the town. Back in the 1980s, this had been an organisation employing nearly 2,500 people, delivering a range of services. By the time the book comes up to date, the same, in terms of its legal form, organisation employs just 200 people. Most of the jobs, many of the functions have been transferred to private companies. Others have simply disappeared. In spite of the formal organisational continuity, it's in fact quite a different organisation in terms of its character and capability and capacity. And the scissors that kind of open up between what such a local council can do and what people expect it to do, of course, then contributes further to the popular disillusion with democracy. Why isn't the local state providing as it should? That's what I want to say, Jackie. I'm sure my time has run up.
Thanks, Mike. That's great. Great to hear from you. I posted a link in the chat that I just Googled and found, but I think it's not working for everyone. So you might have a better link for the book to that you can post in the chat so that people can find it. I'll let you do that. So many thanks for that contribution. So our next speaker is Cédric Lombard. We return to France. Cédric Lombard est directeur de recherche au Centre national de recherche scientifique et membre du Centre de recherche sociologique et politique de Paris. Ses recherches croisent socio-histoire du travail et sociologie des classes sociales. Il a notamment mené des recherches collectives sur les travailleurs et travailleuses du secteur pharmaceutique, sur les mobilisations ouvrières dans les années 68, ou encore sur le croisement des perspectives historiques et ethnographiques sur le travail. Il a également mené une recherche de longue durée sur les ouvriers confrontés à des restructurations répétées. Et donc, c'est de son livre « La restructuration permanente de la condition ouvrière » qui va nous parler aujourd'hui, je pense. And I think there was a little bit of trouble with a translation earlier, but Lauren has put in the chat a file that has an English translation if we need it. Okay, voilà.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup pour la présentation et l'invitation. L'ouvrage et la recherche que je vous présente a, je pense, une double originalité par son objet et par ses méthodes. L'objet, tout d'abord, les nombreux travaux sur les restructurations industrielles ont souvent porté sur les travailleurs et travailleuses qui ont perdu leur emploi et sur les régions désindustrialisées. Pour ma part, j'ai choisi de m'intéresser aux ouvriers qui restent dans les usines après les plans sociaux, ceux qui ne sont pas licenciés. L'ouvrage a donc pour objectif de comprendre et d'analyser les adaptations et les représentations des ouvriers dans un contexte de restructuration répétée ou d'épreuves permanentes d'incertitude depuis les années 70. Alors pour ça, je m'appuie sur une enquête sur des ouvriers d'une entreprise sidérurgique en Belgique, Cockerill, qui a été nationalisée dans les années 80, puis intégrée dans le groupe international ArcelorMittal. Il s'agit ici d'un cas emblématique d'une usine qui a subi les crises avec la multiplication des plans de restructuration, plus d'une dizaine depuis les années 70, d'importantes réorganisations du travail, des diminutions impressionnantes d'effectifs, comme vous pouvez le voir sur le graphique, et des fermetures d'usines. On est passé d'une vingtaine d'usines à 5 usines aujourd'hui depuis les années 70. Alors, sur le plan des méthodes, je pense qu'une particularité de cette enquête, c'est d'abord sa durée. Dans la deuxième moitié des années 1990, j'ai réalisé une recherche durant un plan de restructuration, à la fois sur les pratiques de direction. J'ai réalisé des entretiens avec des dirigeants, des cadres et des représentants syndicaux. J'ai également analysé des archives de direction et j'ai croisé cette recherche avec des observations des pratiques ouvrières dans 3 usines. J'ai suivi les équipes ouvrières pendant environ 10 mois à ce moment-là. En 2010, après l'annonce de nouvelles fermetures, je suis revenu dans cette entreprise et j'ai réalisé des récits de vie d'ouvriers et des délégués syndicaux. J'ai eu accès à de nombreuses et très riches archives, notamment syndicales, et j'ai également observé des mobilisations collectives. Cette revisite et cette combinaison des méthodes, archives, entretiens et observations, permet, je pense, d'appréhender à la fois la production des dispositifs gestionnaires et techniques, d'une part, et d'autre part, les pratiques ouvrières dans un contexte d'incertitude au cœur de la condition ouvrière contemporaine. Alors, dans cet ouvrage, je croise une sociologie des classes sociales et une sociologie historique du travail et des travailleurs, et j'aborde plusieurs thématiques. Tout d'abord, la construction d'une pensée par plan, par la direction et des experts, les débats au sein de la direction et les mobilisations collectives que suscitent les plans sociaux dans un contexte de forte syndicalisation. Tous les ouvriers ici sont syndiqués. Alors, j'analyse ensuite les différents ajustements des collectifs ouvriers en usine face à un même plan de restructuration selon l'histoire sociale locale, les parcours spécifiques des ouvriers, les formes de division du travail, etc. J'étudie également les transformations du syndicalisme de base liées aux multiples réorganisations, au rajeunissement du collectif des militants et à l'élargissement de leur domaine d'intervention. J'accorde aussi une très grande attention aux carrières particulièrement heurtées des ouvriers. J'en livre ici un exemple, des carrières d'ouvriers qui sont confrontés à des changements contraints de poste et d'usine dans la même entreprise durant l'ensemble de leur carrière, ce qui pourrait ici paraître comme des petits changements de carrière sont pour eux et sont vécus comme de très grands déplacements à la fois professionnels et sociaux. J'aborde ensuite la problématique des accidents du travail, très nombreux dans ces usines. J'ai noté près de 20 morts depuis 2002 d'ouvriers dans ces usines et les manières dont les ouvriers tentent de préserver leur corps dans un tel contexte. Enfin, j'analyse les rapports différenciés des ouvriers envers l'entreprise et le travail. On peut distinguer certains ouvriers plus loyaux à l'égard de la direction et critiques à l'égard d'ouvriers vus comme feignants, et d'autres ouvriers qui se montrent beaucoup plus critiques de la direction. De la même manière, j'étudie les manières dont ces ouvriers vivent le fait d'être régulièrement soumis à des remises en cause de leur activité, ainsi que la variété de leur mode de vie, mettant l'accent en particulier sur leur choix de logement et leur mode de consommation, où on peut distinguer un pôle plutôt hédoniste et un pôle plutôt ascétique. Par ces approches, j'ai pu montrer que ces ouvriers se rapprochent des classes moyennes par des salaires élevés, par des tâches très qualifiées pour certains, ainsi que par d'autres caractéristiques de leur mode de vie. Mais j'ai aussi montré qu'ils restent ouvriers par bien d'autres aspects, des débuts de carrière en contrat temporaire et sur des postes manuels, des horaires atypiques, une non-reconnaissance des qualifications acquises sur le tas en cas de déplacement de poste ou d'usine, une exposition importante aux dangers physiques, etc. J'ai surtout insisté dans cet ouvrage sur la différenciation interne au groupe ouvrier. J'ai ainsi distingué une variété de trajectoires professionnelles et sociales qui s'expliquent par les parcours biographiques et scolaires, les types de rapports au travail et le capital social accumulé dans l'entreprise, qui permet pour certains d'envisager des mobilités ascendantes en profitant du départ des plus anciens liés aux réductions d'effectifs, tandis que d'autres subissent plusieurs déclassements dans leur carrière. Dans le contexte de restructuration répétée, ces trajectoires sont aussi liées à des événements qui échappent largement à leur contrôle. En effet, ces trajectoires peuvent être complètement modifiées par le fait d'être au bon ou au mauvais endroit, au bon ou au mauvais moment. Les restructurations leur rappellent ainsi que le statut de salarié stable peut être régulièrement menacé par le déclassement, par les variations de revenus liées au chômage partiel ou encore par les déplacements imposés par les fermetures et réouvertures de sites. Sur un autre plan, la répétition des plans rend également difficilement compréhensibles les décisions des directions pour les ouvriers. Elles compliquent les projections personnelles dans le futur. Elles attisent les fragmentations entre les sous-groupes ouvriers et affermissent les lignes de démarcation ou de clivage entre les ouvriers d'une part et entre les ouvriers, les employés et les cadres d'autre part. Alors, ce sont ici que quelques pistes que je voulais partager avec vous dans ces quelques minutes, que j'ai poursuivies dans cette recherche, sur des mondes ouvriers qui n'ont certes pas disparu complètement, mais qui ont été confrontés à cette réorganisation permanente que l'on peut retrouver, il me semble, dans un grand nombre de secteurs industriels et de services depuis une vingtaine d'années. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Merci Cédric, merci beaucoup. Okay, so our next speaker is Tracy Newman. Are you ready to go, Tracy? Tracy is an associate professor of history at Wayne State University. She specializes in transnational and global approaches to 20th century US history with an emphasis on cities and the built environment. She's the author of Remaking the Rust Belt, the Post-Industrial Transformation of North America, with the University of Pennsylvania Press, which came out in 2016, and also an author of essays on urban history and public policy. Her current research examines the political, cultural and intellectual history of the global dissemination of urban design and international development concepts since 1945, with a focus on the role of philanthropic foundations and international organizations. So over to you, Tracy. I know you're fighting with allergies, but hopefully you're going to be able to.
I've only had to sneeze once, so of course, like in the next 5 minutes, they will flare up. So thanks for that. I was listening to as you listened to you introduce me, I realized I really need to cut my biography down and put fewer commas in it, so it is more readable for other people. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm particularly excited because as I imagine lots of folks, have not been super up on my reading for the last 18 months if it wasn't for my class. So it's really exciting for me to get to hear about all of these books I haven't had a chance to read yet, and be in such great company. I think my book is actually the most senior work in the symposium, if you will. And listening to folks, I feel like it's starting to show its age, which I'm actually really delighted about. Deindustrialization has been a really vibrant field and headed in a lot of different directions since 2016. And it's very exciting for me to see so many people particularly interested in comparative and transnational approaches, which is kind of my thing, and to hearing about the increased attention to race in the newer literature, which has long been a criticism and a fair one. So, as Jackie said, Remaking the Rust Belt was published in 2016 by Penn. It's turning 5 in June. I'm going to try to stay pretty true to the format today and run under 7 minutes if I can even. I feel like after 5 years, I should kind of have my elevator pitch down and know what my book is about. But as usual, this is always a challenge. So what I'm going to do is give you a very brief summary of the book and then try to go through its major interventions at kind of a global level and not talk too much about the particulars of the cases. But I did want to make a quick note on the terminology. So I'll be talking more about post-industrialism than deindustrialization, but my work is very much rooted in the histories of deindustrialization, right? Steve's first book in particular really shaped mine. And I think that Remaking the Rust Belt very much contributes to the deindustrialization literature. And of course, deindustrialization and post-industrialism are very much overlapping and usually related processes. So in Remaking the Rust Belt, which I don't have handy, I could show you some of your books, which are sitting next to me, but mine is nowhere in sight. In Remaking the Rust Belt, I use Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania and Hamilton, Ontario, which are both steel towns located a few hundred miles apart on opposite sides of the US-Canadian border, as cases through which to tell a larger transnational story about the post-industrial transformation of North Atlantic manufacturing centers, really between roughly the 1960s and the 1990s. I talk about the 1950s a little bit. So popular narratives tend to portray the decline of basic industry in the regions in which that decline took place as a historical inevitability. And obviously all of your work pushes back against this as well, but I think this is actually still a common narrative, right? That this is an unfortunate byproduct of natural business cycles, neutral market forces. So in the book, I set out to tell a different story, right? One in which growth coalitions composed of local political and business elites actively set out to create post-industrial places. They hired the same international consultants, and they shared ideas about urban revitalization on study tours, at conferences, and in the pages of professional journals. These growth coalitions narrowly focused on creating the jobs, services, leisure activities, and cultural institutions that they believed would attract middle-class professionals back to central cities at the expense of their working-class residents, and they did this consciously. In the process, I show, local officials fostered an increasing economic inequality among their residents by abandoning social democratic goals in favor of corporate welfare programs. But the story here isn't, of course, simply one about elite ideas of how to redevelop cities for new jobs and new people, though I will admit that was my primary focus. I also explore to some extent how diverse groups of residents developed alternative visions for what their cities might become and how they challenged or supported growth coalitions' redevelopment plans with varying degrees of success. So that's sort of a quick summary of the book, which makes 4 related interventions, and I'll just sort of go through those quickly. First, I show post-industrialism was neither natural nor inevitable. It was the outcome of conscious decisions made by political and economic elites in conflict or cooperations with residents. And I think there was a lot of co-optation in particular going on that I think is a key note here. Second, I showed that the Rust Belt, which was commonly think of as an American region, was in fact a transnational phenomenon that included Western European, right, as well as North American cities. And this is something that geographers and sociologists have talked about for quite some time, and clearly folks today are talking about, but certainly at least Americanist historians were a bit slower to recognize this. We tend to be a little inward focused, the Americanists. Third, I demonstrate that post-industrialism was an internationally circulating redevelopment model that essentially provided a menu of strategies and tactics that local growth coalitions, local officials could pick and choose among as they tried to adapt it to local circumstances. And fourth, I historicize neoliberal urbanism. And this is nothing new for geographers and sociologists, right? And I'll note my co-panelist, Jason Hackworth, who is up shortly, his work on neoliberal cities especially informed my own. And so, geographers and sociologists have said for a long time that there's this menu of tactics and strategies that I was just talking about, right? Things like capital subsidies, supply side intervention, public-private partnerships, and that's what I see as really essential here. Central city makeovers, place branding. These have been described for a long time as hallmarks of neoliberal urbanism by social scientists who aren't historians. That this neoliberal urbanism that became ascendant in North Atlantic nations in the late 1970s. So, I sort of make the argument instead that these tactics had much longer histories, that there was nothing particularly neoliberal or even particularly new about many of them as urban development tactics, but they were deployed in new ways with different intentions and in changing institutional settings at a time when liberals and conservatives increasingly came to share the same political imagination in sort of the 70s and 80s. So yeah, I think I was probably well under 7 minutes there, and I think I hit all of my major points, and also I'm a fast talker. So thanks for listening to me, and thanks for having me, and I look forward to hearing from everyone else.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks so much. Okay, so we have two more speakers left, so we're nearly at the end of our kind of marathon run through all these fascinating works. And our next speaker is Jason Hackworth. So Jason is a professor of geography and planning, as Tracy just mentioned, at the University of Toronto. His focus is broadly on race and political economy in North American cities. And specifically, he writes about the ways that anti-Black racism exacerbates deprivation in a post-industrial context. He's the author of 3 books: The Neoliberal City from 2007, Faith-Based from 2012, and Manufacturing Decline in 2019. And I presume it's on that last book that you're going to be talking to us today. Jason, over to you.
Yes. All right, thank you. Let me share my screen quickly. Okay, so I think everyone can see that. So thank you, merci, to those who were, Jackie, Lauren, Stephen, of course, for organizing and including me in this. I'm new to this group, so and I'm not a historian, although I sometimes feel like I should become one. So if this is new to anyone or we don't get your question in later, please feel free to contact me later to chat. I enjoy these kinds of follow-up interactions afterwards. Okay, so yes, it is the most recent book, Manufacturing Decline, that I am here to speak about. And this came out about 1.5 years ago, and it, like so many of the others that are being discussed today, takes a comparative approach. I don't focus on one particular city or even 2 or a handful, but dozens of American Rust Belt cities, and try to use a kind of social science methodology of just trying to understand what explains some of the kind of variation, or what explains particularly the appearance of dereliction, the appearance of land abandonment. My primary, using the kind of language of sociology, geography, whatever, dependent variable, the thing that I look at the most is land abandonment, visibly derelict landscapes, abandoned landscapes that are rife in certain locations. And I use this because I see it as a kind of a signal, a very deep form of decline. I see it as something that's very unlikely to change on its own devices. And it's often very used as a very kind of visible form of evidence of deindustrialization itself. In fact, this is when you know, most explanations, social science documentaries, whatever, of landscapes like this, it usually starts and stops with an explanation of manufacturing job loss, and that's what sort of collapsed the labor market, housing market, and that's why you end up with landscapes like this. The truth is, though, that if you compare a sort of wider set of cities, particularly, and there are dozens in the American Rust Belt that lost similar amounts of manufacturing employment, it is a pretty inefficient explanatory device by itself. I'm not saying it's useful to lose 90% of manufacturing employment in any of these individual cities. I'm saying that almost every city in the American Rust Belt, small and large, lost considerable numbers and comparable numbers of manufacturing employment, but not every city has landscapes that look like these in Cleveland, St. Louis, and Detroit. So my emphasis has been on sort of like what are the variables if in that sort of subset of cities that explain the appearance of these landscapes, the location of these landscapes, the prevalence, and it is highly associated with the presence of Black populations, primarily post-Great Migration Black populations in these individual cities. So I guess in some ways it uses a kind of racial capitalism framework to kind of explain. Not every form of anti-Black racism has an economic outcome, but many do, and many, in my view, have had a great deal to do with generating the forces that we see as kind of evidence of deindustrialization, massive depopulation, derelict landscapes, housing abandonment, et cetera. I focus on several modalities that I think are particularly important that at sort of generating this, generating these outcomes. First being the legacy effects of once legal discrimination, redlining in particular, but all sorts of other forms that were only legally outlawed in 1968 and not very effectively so. The over-policing of Black spaces and long-time housing and job discrimination that has driven many Black people into the criminal justice system and having acute impacts on income and neighborhood stability. The simple refusal, we don't talk about it as much anymore, but I think it's as prevalent as it has ever been, the simple refusal of white people to live in Black neighborhoods or to allow significant numbers of Black people to move into white majority neighborhoods, no matter what the economic level. And finally, the veritable sabotage of urban economies by firms and state governments when that city becomes governed by a Black mayor or Black city council, or becomes dominated, demographically dominated by Black people, making it more difficult for Black cities to turn a corner when they're seen as nemesis to corporations and state capitals, which they have. In total, cumulatively, my argument is that these forces accelerate extant processes of urban decline on their own, and they destabilize neighborhoods, they destabilize people, they weaken cities, and they hasten the flight of capital from those places, capital and people. That's sort of the beginning. Then I'll just sort of end, just sort of gesture to the end of the remainder of the book, which is about sort of trying to understand the political impact of these images, the political impact of narratives explaining deindustrialization, or what happened in places like Detroit. And it's you know, a substantial portion of the book, and it's about really how these conditions motivate rather than being seen as something to solve. These get seen as sort of, or get positioned, particularly by the conservative movement in the United States, as sort of bêtes noires, these places that need to be avoided by other places, and it motivates a kind of deprivationist urban policy rather than motivating one that might actually solve these problems. It actually motivates something that seeks to further punish these spaces and to justify policies of this sort in other cities. The book ends, and I'll end this very short presentation with you know, a chapter that's called Urban Decline Was Planned, which is a lifting of Polanyi's famous notion that laissez-faire was planned from his famous book. And it ends with basically two overlapping points, the book that relate to all of this. One is that you know, there's nothing natural about urban decline. That's a theme that I think has been repeated again quite a few times today. It is a series of political decisions. Deindustrialization does not automatically lead to landscapes like Detroit. And second, and very much overlapping with this, these political decisions are motivated by race as much as any other factor, at least in the American Rust Belt. But while there's lots of literature on racial discrimination and lots of literature on urban decline, until recently, these have not had much interaction with one another. And I think that there should be. And this is, I guess, my contribution to to suggesting that there should be. So thank you. I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to take questions. Again, if anyone wants to interact outside of this forum, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jason. That's great. Okay, so we come to our last short talk, and that's from Gabriel Winant. I'm assuming that I'm pronouncing you correctly, Gabriel. I'm slightly tempted to pronounce you in a French way, but I'm guessing that that would be incorrect.
Winant, actually, so neither French nor the kind of obvious version.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that correction. Gabriel is assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago. His writing regularly appears in magazines such as The Nation, Dissent, and M+1. And his book, The Next Shift, The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America, was published this year by Harvard University Press. So I will hand straight over to you, Gabriel, to talk to us about the book.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks to everyone who's preceded me. This has been really fascinating and wonderful, and I've learned a lot, especially, as Tracy said, given my own kind of American parochialism on questions of deindustrialization. So I'm going to share my screen. One moment here. Okay. Okay. So my book is about what came after job loss and the material connections between the new service economy and the old industrial economy. And I want to actually start with a genre of journalism that I'm sure you all know and I'm sure you all hate and will recognize. This is the genre we saw especially in 2015-16 when metropolitan journalists venture to deindustrialized towns to talk about why have you all turned to the right, why are you voting for Trump in the American case. And I noticed in story after story like this, the people that, the New York Times or whoever it might be actually found to interview were actually healthcare workers over and over. Here in Indianapolis, a story about the famous carrier plant that became a central issue in the 2016 campaign. We meet Haley Duncan, who is about to take a low-wage job in healthcare. Here in Williamson, West Virginia, we meet a phlebotomist and a respiratory therapist in a story about coal miners. In Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a former steel town, Politico has repeatedly returned to interview their local informant who is a retired nurse. Now, this is not, oh, and sorry, I forgot one. In Monessen, Pennsylvania, the New York Times found a Pittsburgh hospital worker named Turkovich to inform them on why steel workers were voting for Trump. So this is not a coincidence. The pattern of healthcare employment in this country, obviously there's a healthcare system to some extent nationwide, but it does have a distinctive geography. And looking at this geography, I think can tell us a good deal about both the current shape of the labor market and its roots in the industrial economy. So these are the largest, among major metropolitan counties in the United States, these are the ones with the largest percentage of the workforce committed to the category of healthcare and social assistance. And you can see just, with a glance, what region of the country we're in here, right? This is almost exclusively the post-industrial North and Midwest. So this happened because private health insurance became widely available to working class people in this country in the late 1940s and 1950s through private sector collective bargaining over welfare benefits such as health and retirement, which emerged as an alternative to national health insurance. Union members formed the foundation of the growing health insurance and healthcare market. By the late 1950s, when Blue Cross emerged as the nation's most important insurer, about 6% of its business came just from the steel industry. So in response to this growing market, hospitals, overwhelmingly private and formerly nonprofit, grew. They upgraded rapidly over the post-war decades. And the strange public-private shape of the system, as it had developed in response to collectively bargained private social insurance, then came to matter enormously as deindustrialization set in. So we often think of industrial job loss as something that happened in the 1980s and forward, but as others have said today, it began to affect industrial communities as soon as the late 1950s in the United States, is basically as soon as the Korean War was over. So my own research is about Pittsburgh, which, as Tracy says in her excellent book and in her presentation, was a steel town and went through a somewhat traumatic transition to being no longer a steel making town. Pittsburgh lost almost 80,000 metal production jobs between 1950 and 1980. So that's before the disaster of the 1980s. When this happens, there's this whole set of social processes that follow. Working class people get poorer, obviously. The labor market baseline falls, and this process is racialized. It presses down on African Americans first and hardest, who were trapped in the worst jobs, who were the last hired and the first fired. But the population also gets older, as you can see here, quite dramatically. And finally, the population gets sicker. Now, this is because it's getting older, and older populations are sicker populations as a general actuarial rule, but also because it's getting poorer. Poorer populations, again, are also generally sicker populations. And finally, because it's undergoing a kind of social distress that manifests in the form of patient demand. And let me explain what that would look like. Rising economic distress destabilizes larger kinship systems built on extended family cooperation. So even if some of the older men are still at work in the factory, the fact that the younger ones can't join them there and are made likelier to leave town starts to eat into economic security. This causes women, particularly younger women, to seek employment where their mothers might not have done so. As this happens, the supply of free care formerly available from women in the household is diminished. But if you have good insurance, that's sort of okay, because you can use the hospital like a medium-term nursing home facility. And this is basically what winds up happening. So in 1979, at the kind of midpoint of the process of industrial job loss, Pittsburgh generates an astronomical 1.6 hospital inpatient days per capita. That's triple the national level in the United States. What that means at the moment, and what that means, just put it simply, is if everyone went to the hospital the same amount in Pittsburgh that year, everyone would have spent a day and a half in the hospital. Now, that's obviously not what happened. A lot of people spent a lot more time there. If we look at average length of hospital stay in 1981, we can see Pittsburgh ranks 24th among US cities in terms of this average. And here are the cities ahead of it, except for Washington, DC. These are uniformly industrial cities undergoing manufacturing job loss in this period. So the healthcare system swells up to service all this demand. Pittsburgh in 1980 has 5 hospital beds per 1,000 people, has 7 per 1,000 by 1990, compared to a national level today of just under 3. So that's regionally more than twice as much hospital capacity per person as we have nationwide today. Finally, when deindustrialization does take a hard downward turn in the early 1980s, it speeds all of this up. Youth outmigration accelerates, austerity intensifies, the population itself experiences intense physical stress. In a 2009 study, economists examined Pennsylvanians with lengthy seniority in industrial jobs who filed for unemployment in the early 1980s, and they found that their risk of death increased 50 to 100% in the immediate years after job loss. But the healthcare system is relatively shielded. Medicare and Medicaid budgets actually increased. Those are the kind of public welfare state social insurance entitlements. Collectively bargained private sector benefits typically lasted months or even years after layoffs. And retiree benefits were often quite secure for decades more and could kick in as early as age 45, since many had taken early retirement. So you have this one stream of income that keeps pumping, even as everything else is getting cut off. And a population that increasingly, therefore, are going to become reorganized as patients, so they can use this stream of income to stay alive, causing the system to continue to grow. And it keeps adding jobs with it. As men are pushed out of secure industrial work, particularly women flood into these jobs, and especially women of color. These are much lower paying and more insecure jobs, but they were growing while everything else was collapsing. Now, I want to conclude by saying that, so here is just a chart of the comparison of these two industries over time, and you can see the crucial period between, in the Pittsburgh region, you can see the crucial period between 1970 and 1990, which is the period of decomposition and recomposition, as we could think of it. I want to conclude by talking about working conditions in healthcare. Healthcare workers were not covered by labor law until the 1970s, so they didn't have union rights for most of the period of the industry's construction. And because the industry's origin was to serve, its purpose was to serve the deserving, secure, and more powerful fractions of the working class. It drew on the relatively powerless fractions for its own labor needs. Labor costs matter enormously in this story. In fact, the care economy is distinctive because it is so labor intensive. It offers little opportunity for productivity increase of the kind that sustained the labor capital compromise of the earlier years. So there's a zero-sum kind of reality, which shapes what Jost Esping Andersen calls the trilemma of post-industrial labor markets. Policymakers can deregulate labor markets to create employment, but wages will fall. They can regulate labor markets to increase wages, but at the cost of rising unemployment, or they can raise taxes or borrow to socialize service work. And what I'm arguing is that this choice was historically made decades ago, not through labor market policy, but through social insurance policy, through the organization of the healthcare system in the United States. From the perspective of workers, this dynamic manifests as downward pressure on wages, and especially on staffing, as employers try to pass on costs to labor by limiting employment levels. Care jobs accounted for 56% of new low-wage jobs in the US in the 1980s, 63% in the 1990s, and 72% in the 2000s of new low-wage jobs, because care, as I've been saying, has been our system for absorbing and managing the damage of deindustrialization. And this returns us to the present, and I'll stop here with one of the many painful lessons of the past year in particular, the paradox of so-called essential work. Healthcare workers are collectively indispensable, right? They represent the kind of human embodiment of our social systems for managing social distress and economic loss, but they're individually disposable. And this dynamic, in fact, is much older than 2020. This paradox frames the struggles that have developed and certainly I think will further develop around healthcare. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Gabriel.